else to my talk, 25 years of SSL, secure-ish sockets layer. So this is kind of a talk of two halves, really. So the first half, we're going to be taking a look through, I guess, the chronological history of encryption online. So HTTPS, SSL encryption, however we might refer to it, this idea of having more and more encryption on the web and online has really changed, especially over like the last kind of 5 years. So the amount of encryption we have on the web has fundamentally changed, but we've had encryption available for a really long time. So I want to take a look at the kind of chronological history of how that has progressed. And then in the second kind of half of the talk, if you will, to take a look at some of the problems surrounding that and some of the ways that I think that we can move forwards. But first of all, I want to get started with a question. Now, this is back in the world of when I was in a room of people and I could ask people to raise their hand or to shout out answers to questions. This is obviously a lot easier. Now, I have my Slack channel open over here. So if you want to make any questions or comments, please do post them into the Slack channel. I'll be keeping an eye on that. Obviously, things are slightly different at the moment, so we're going to adapt to that and we'll find a way to get through. So what I want everyone to do is to take a look at this icon that I'm about to put on the screen and just think, what does it mean when you see it? Like, what's the first thing that you think of when you see this? Now, normally, as I said, I would ask people to shout out words or tell me what they think of. And I've done this talk just a couple of times before, actually. So this is still reasonably new and I keep updating it as I go. But generally speaking, in a technical audience like this, you have to remember, I'm speaking to a group of very technically inclined people here. People will shout out things like HTTPS or SSL, and there must be one person, at least in the Slack, that's seen this before. But normally people shout out encryption or secure or, padlock or lock or, something along those lines, something that means those kinds of things. Now, there's at least one person that must have seen a previous version of this talk because they posted the answer into the Slack channel. And the answer is that no, this is not a padlock. This does not mean encryption. This does not mean anything to do with any technical thing. This is a handbag icon. Or if you're American or from a different part of the world to me, you may refer to this as a purse. But this is not a lock. This is not encryption. This is not a handbag icon. Apparently, this is literally what this means. This is a green purse. Now, I first came across this idea because for me, as a technical person, like many of you will be, for me, this has always meant padlock, lock, secure, encryption, or something of that description. And I came across my first ever instance of this being referred to as a handbag from this tweet, actually, from someone called Adrian Portofel, who is definitely worth following on Twitter. And if you look at the timestamp on this, and that's more specifically, I guess, the date down at the bottom there, this was from 2015. And this was the first ever time that I'd kind of come across this idea that my interpretation of this icon meant one thing and somebody else's interpretation of this icon could mean something completely different. And I was looking at this and I'm like, how could, it's up in the address bar, it's right next to the HTTPS thing, it's clearly a technical indicator. How could someone think that this is a handbag and not clearly what it is, which is a padlock? And I was like, well, I'll do some quick research. I'll see, how could someone come to this conclusion? And it actually didn't take me very long to figure out how someone could arrive at this conclusion that it was actually like a purse or a handbag or something like this. And it was one of the first websites that I went to. I was, browsing around the UIs of different big popular websites. And hopefully everyone can see the padlock icon on this page, right? Like, it's really clear. It's really obvious. It's up there at the top on the right-hand side. And I'm not referring to the one in the top left. And actually, now that you kind of look at them, if I just zoom in on the padlock as well, if you look at these two things side by side, actually, I'm like, okay, now maybe I can see where a little bit of this confusion comes from, because they do have, well, quite a lot of characteristics that they share if we look at them both side by side. So this is a point that I'm going to be coming back to throughout the talk, because this idea of our expectations of what we understand when we see something and what a user understands when they see something is, when it comes to encryption and other technologies like this, it is a problem that we come across quite a lot. But of course, for me and us, I'm talking about this handbag, this padlock icon here. The one that indicates the website that you are visiting has HTTPS, that you have an encrypted connection to that website. So I want to take a look at the story of encryption, how it's become this really big thing recently, and many more people are aware of encryption than were previously. We have encryption now on probably most of the websites that you visit day to day. Try and think, is there a website that I go to day to day that doesn't have encryption on it? And I struggle nowadays. We're kind of cracking on through 2020 now, as long as it's taken us to get through the middle part of 2020 with recent events. But I would struggle to sit down and say, here is a list of websites I use that don't have HTTPS. But if we go back to the very beginning of HTTPS, the first time we had HTTPS on the internet, your iPod looked like this. This is how you listen to music. You didn't have AirPods, and you weren't listening to it through your iPhone or other similar device. You were using an iPod that looked like this. Now, these things were really cool. I had one of these with a little clicky wheel. They didn't have flash memory in the earlier versions. They had actual spinning rust inside them. They had hard drives inside them. If you're a gamer, this is what your console looked like when encryption first came to the web. And when encryption first came to the web, you had never seen a QR code before, right? Like, QR codes did not exist when we first got encryption on the web. This is a pretty kind of staggering difference when you think about this. Like, these are the things that now we consider so ancient and antiquated, yet they did not even exist. You have to go back all the way to when your smartphone was not a smartphone and the battery lasted more than a day, and you had something like this, the IBM Simon. This came out in 1994, the same year that encryption on the web came out. And it was actually the same year that we had the opening of the Channel Tunnel between the UK and France. Now, I don't know what's happening with Brexit in the UK. I think the building project has been delayed to close this. Obviously, the UK government is very keen to get us out of the EU and close us off. So maybe by the time that we all next meet in person next year at an NDC event, then maybe I won't be able to get there. But I digress. The kind of the very first time that you will see encryption in a browser in the traditional sense that you would expect to see it today, your browser looks like this. This is version 1 of Netscape Navigator. This came out in 1994, and it was the first browser to have support for HTTPS. Of course, we have to be able to go back far enough to the point where there was a first, and it looked like this. Now, the early focus on encryption online was largely around e-commerce, and this was one of the big drivers to have security in our web communications. If you go to a website and punch in your credit card number or some kind of payment details, and the communication of those details was not secure, then of course that's going to leave you open to potentially some people seeing those details and using them in ways that you didn't intend. So this was a really large driver. This was a really large motivator. Now, SSL, the first encryption protocol that we had, the secure sockets layer, was actually created in-house at Netscape. And as I said, we have to go all the way back to 1994 in order to start from the very beginning. So SSL was created, version 1 was created, as I said, by Netscape. And if you are familiar with encryption protocols, and more specifically the different versions, you may never actually remember SSL version 1. And that was because it kind of never really came into existence as such. This was the first ever attempt at creating one. Netscape built and made SSL version 1. They were getting ready for the release, and they went to kind of a technical meeting at MIT at the time, and they're like, hey, we've made this protocol, we have version 1, we are going to add encryption to the web, and this is what it is going to look like. And during that meeting, that 1-hour meeting that they didn't actually make it all the way through, somebody found a flaw with the protocol that was being presented, and they presented that flaw in the meeting and said, hey, this thing kind of doesn't work as intended. There's this big problem with it. So it never actually made it past even being announced, which is why, even if you are familiar with encryption protocols, you're perhaps not familiar with SSL version 1, because it never kind of came out into the world. So off they go. Netscape kind of makes some very quick changes, and very quickly we arrive at SSL version 2. Now, SSL version 2, released later in the same year, is something that you may have heard of, because this was kind of the first protocol version that actually made it out into the big wide world, and you may have more reasonably come across and heard of. Although it didn't last long either. So with the kind of very limited amount of scrutiny on SSL version 1, it was broken almost immediately, as I said. SSL version 2 kind of made it through those initial hurdles, went out into the big wide world, and then got a lot more scrutiny. Obviously, once something is released publicly, a lot more attention can be brought onto it. And SSL version 2 did not last long. It didn't actually last a year before it was broken. So, and it was actually literally in the several months before it was broken. So immediately following its release, a few months later, SSL version 2 was broken, and Netscape rushed through to make SSL version 3 to replace that. So SSL version 3 was released around a year later in 1995. Now, already, and we're only talking 1 year since the releases of our first kind of encryption protocol, already we're seeing an increase in adoption. We're seeing an increase in interest and the realization that actually, the web is growing, the web is becoming more important. This encryption thing is a good idea. Now, as I said, SSL was developed in-house at Netscape. They made it. It was their thing. They did SSL 1, 2, and then 3. Now, there was another popular browser at the time. If anyone was using the web extensively in the kind of mid to late 90s, you'll know that there was another browser to rival Netscape's Navigator, and it was made by a company called Microsoft. They had such a cool logo back then when they looked like a heavy metal band. But they were like, no, we're not going to use SSL. We're going to build our own protocol. So for the issues between SSL 2, Netscape patched up to SSL 3. Microsoft kind of forked off at that point, and they went a slightly different way. And what they did was they created their own protocol called PCT, which was Private Communications Technology. So, Netscape went from SSL 2 to SSL 3. Microsoft were like, okay, we're going to branch off. We're going to create PCT. Now, this was only supported in Internet Explorer, which was, of course, Microsoft's browser at the time, and IIS. So this was an unfortunate way for things to go, because we don't want this divergence of protocols. We don't want this fork in the road. We don't want to have one browser and web server supporting one thing and another supporting another. But this was the way that it went. PCT became a thing, Private Communications Technology, as I said. And this looked very unfortunate, actually. But that was what happened at the time. And it didn't last for very long, though. So if we push forward to just 1999, Netscape again released another iteration of their protocol. And it was, as you can see here, quite literally a minor version bump. It was a small change. And they bumped the version up to 3.1. They're like, okay, couple of tidy up things. We're going to fix some stuff, deprecate some stuff. We're going to move and bump up to version 3.1. Now, again, of course, like Microsoft would have to do something very similar with PCT. But the wider industry all kind of agreed here that it wasn't the best thing that we have these different protocols. It would be great if we could all come together and unify on a single protocol that everybody could focus on supporting well. Now, of course, that meant getting Microsoft on board. It's like, well, Microsoft have PCT and Internet Explorer and IIS. We need to get them to come together. So the best way to do this was to have a kind of an independent third party take charge here, if you will. And that independent party came in the form of the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force. And it was agreed that the standardization and the management and looking after the protocol would switch from Netscape and Microsoft individually over to the IETF. Now, this was a good idea. Everyone could agree that this was a good idea, but you have to get Netscape and Microsoft to agree on this as well. And there was a single sticking point for Microsoft. Now, because SSL, the secure sockets layer, had been created by Netscape and had been under their kind of stewardship for the last 5 years at this point, there was some brand association with that. Back then, if you said SSL, people would kind of hear and think Netscape, because they made it, they created it, they introduced it, it was their thing. So Microsoft didn't want the IETF to just take on board the SSL name and essentially put their stamp of approval on it. It's like, no, this has brand association. We want something that's not associated with a different vendor. Obviously, Microsoft and Netscape, huge browser rivals. They really didn't want that to happen. And they were like, the IETF can take charge and will follow as long as the name changes. So the name changed at this point. And again, you may be looking at this slide and thinking SSL version 3.1. I've never heard of that. If you're familiar with encryption protocols, because it never actually became formally known as SSL version 3.1. When the IETF took charge, and they had to rename it at the insistence of Microsoft. And it was renamed to Transport Layer Security, which was TLS, which is something that you may have heard of before, you may be familiar with. So TLS was the new name for the protocol that was taken under the stewardship of the IETF. So we have TLS version 1.0, which again, you've probably come across and you've probably heard of. Now, given this name change, this sounds like a new protocol, right? We're changing the name from SSL, from PCT, it's becoming TLS. Many people think this was a new protocol, some significant change. It came in 1999, right before the new millennium. You know, it sounded like a big thing, but actually, all that happened was something very, very minor. They took the SSL version 3.1 document, the specification document, and they erased the SSL part at the top. They just rubbed it out, and they wrote TLS. So here on the left-hand side of the screen, I have the RFC for TLS 1.0. This is the RFC, the specification for the protocol. And on the right-hand side here, I have a slightly zoomed-in section from this document, just a little bit further down, that talks about the versioning fields. So when I say they changed the name at the top of the document, they quite literally did, because if we look down here for the versioning, the version is still set as 3.1. because it was SSL 3.1. Now, in the interest of compatibility and not breaking clients by changing, you know, like if we're on 3.1 in the version field and then we go to TLS 1.0, if we change the version field to 1.0, is 1.0 now better than 3.0? And none of these things would make sense. In the interest of compatibility with clients breaking because of the expectation that the version field would always increment, perhaps. There were lots of different considerations here, but basically they just changed the name from SSL 3.1 to TLS 1.0. And this is why we can still see things like 3.1 in the version field, because that part was never changed. It was just the name that we refer to. So now we have TLS 1.0. The new millennium comes in. We have our single unified protocol now. There is no longer, you know, there's still support for SSL and PCT out there, but going forwards from this point, we now have a single protocol that we can focus on. So a few more years later, we come up to 2006 now, and it's time to do a little bit of tidying up. It's time to do a little bit of maintenance. It's time to just do a couple of quick security fixes in the protocol. So in 2006, now fully under the stewardship of the IETF, TLS version 1.1 was released. So as you can see, minor version bump, nothing particularly fundamental changed here. This was largely just focused around security improvements. But it's kind of interesting because a release, an update for a protocol that's all about encryption and security, you know, this is what TLS is designed to give us, has an update release that is largely focused on security. But the adoption of this was not very high. So if we take a look at some data here, so this is data from roughly the top 150,000 websites in the world, detailing the protocol versions that they support. Now, it's very hard to go too far back in time and have reliable data around this kind of information. So you'll see throughout the talk here, I'm going to be presenting a lot of graphs and a lot of data, and most of it goes back to around about 2012, because that's as far back as I could go in my research and have at least a few reliable sources of data that I could compare to each other. So it is very difficult to go that far back in time and have multiple sources of accurate data, but this shows as far back as I could reasonably go. So you can see here, this graph is just showing the highest version of the protocol supported. Now, the interesting thing here is TLS 1.1, which is the protocol version we're currently talking about. You might not even be able to see that line in orange because it's the one that just sits flat across the bottom. And as far as we can go back, even with some, you know, less reliable sources or independent sources of data, TLS 1.1 never really had any uptake. It was never really the protocol of choice. And you can see here, you know, if we go back on the left side of the graph here, right on the very left edge, this is kind of around about 2012, the start of 2012. And the yellow line at the top, which is basically the vast majority of support, that is TLS 1.0. Now, in 2012, we have to remember that TLS 1.1, the updated version, has been available for 6 years. And it's right down there at the bottom of the graph, and no one is using it, basically. TLS 1.0, the original version, is still quite clearly, I mean, that's right up at kind of 90-something% of websites were using TLS 1.0, 6 years after 1.1 was released. Now, 1.1 had lots of security improvements in it. Why were people not using this? Well, we can take a look at the next protocol version to try and answer this question. And in 2008, again, still under the charge of the IETF, another update to TLS was released. So this is just a couple of years later. So 2 years after 1.1 came out, TLS version 1.2 came out. Now, if you're familiar with encryption online, TLS 1.2 should really start to ring some bells, because this was a very prominent release of the protocol. Now, TLS 1.2, again, you can see it's a minor version bump. It had a couple of security fixes, a couple of things deprecated that we don't want anymore, a couple of minor changes. But one of the biggest things released in TLS 1.2 was actually a very significant performance increase. So by 2008, the encrypted web is growing. The web is now everywhere and everything. And the performance cost of doing encryption is becoming more and more notable as more and more people do it. So TLS 1.2 had an incredible focus on improving the performance. So we could really start to chop down on the performance cost of doing encryption. Now, this is interesting because in a protocol release like this one, if we just go back to that same graph, and now we have those two pieces of information, TLS 1.1 largely around security fixes, we can see it's this orange line at the bottom with, I think we can say, virtually no one choosing to use it. I think that's a reasonable thing to say. But then now consider that with TLS 1.2, which is the blue line, as you can see here. So TLS 1.2, just a few years after its release, is already starting to see this really strong growth. So remember, this is the highest protocol version that a website supports. And TLS 1.2 is just seeing this meteoric growth because it had an incentive for people to use it. And I say that, and I realized that TLS 1.1 had an incentive for people to use it because it was an improved version and it was more secure. But I've often found that just making something more secure and releasing a new version of it, and the data shows this here, it's not always enough to get people on board. However, TLS 1.2 came along and they're like, hey, there's a boatload of performance advantages here, make your stuff go a lot faster. It always kind of reminds me of like kind of how Apple do their iOS updates. If I speak to my non-technical friends and family members or anything like that, and it's like, oh, you know, the new iOS update came out, and they're like, oh, yeah, we installed that last night. And I'm like, wow, I didn't know that you actually updated things. Most people don't normally kind of pay attention to that. And it's like, oh, yes, but there was like 5 new emojis in there that I really want. And I was like, okay, there's 5 new emojis. Let's not worry about all the critical security patches that came out in that iOS update or anything like that. Let's just focus on the fact that we got 5 new emojis. But I was like, you know what? If that's what it takes to get people paying attention to updates and installing them, give them something that they actually want. And this graph proves that, you know, if people wanted the performance advantage, they'll upgrade to TLS 1.2. And you can see here in just a few years, there was a really significant change there. But the other kind of problem then as well is if we take the same data again, but now rather than just look at the highest protocol version supported, also look at the lowest supported. So this is now showing, you know, basically the range of protocols that websites offer. There is still, you know, despite that very strong growth of TLS 1.2 over those 6 or 7 years there are still some other kind of concerning trends. So if we take a look at SSL version 2 now, which is the purple line, this is, I mean, SSL version 2 broken in 1994. Remember that. That's the first thing. So it's a decade before 2014 when we're still seeing probably around about 30% of sites offering it as a protocol they support. So yes, you know, to clarify, they do offer higher protocol versions, but they're still offering support for someone to use SSL version 2. Now, in 2015, just prior to 2015 here on the graph, you can see with SSL version 3, there was a really sharp decline. For those of you that followed along in the tech news at the time, something called Poodle happened, which was a flaw found in SSL version 3 that effectively broke it. And you can see up until this point, you know, we're virtually at 100% support for SSL version 3. Again, as a protocol version that websites offered the support for, not necessarily the only one that they supported. But anyway, 2015 comes, Poodle happens, people start turning off the support for SSL version 3 because it's no longer appropriate for clients to use it. Now, even given the fact that we have really solid data for this, it happened in a time when we can find multiple sources of data. You can see this nice sharp decline, and then almost this kind of plateau down at the bottom, very similar to what happens with SSL v2. You can see that the decline is gradually easing off. And this is just this tale of legacy that we have on the web where maybe people aren't keeping up to date with their patches. These are abandoned websites that aren't being maintained anymore. Whatever this is, we have just this inevitable part of the web that seems to just tail on for considerably longer than it should. And this does slow us down a little bit. This is problematic. But the last thing to talk about is this little green blip here on the end of the graph. And to do that, we have to fast forward all the way to 2018. Now, in 2018, this is the current latest release of the protocol from the IETF. This is TLS version 1.3. Now, this was, again, it was a minor version bump in terms of the numbers. Here you can see we've gone from 1.2 to 1.3. But this was a fundamental change in the protocol. This was a super significant update. TLS 1.3 brought some amazing performance advantages again, just like TLS version 1.2 brought 10 years earlier. TLS 1.3, we saw, if I just go back one slide and look at that graph, you can see when TLS 1.3 was introduced, it didn't start at 0 and come up. It was just like, bam, straight in there with a, kind of around about 10% there. And it's seen good growth in the year or so that we have the data for. So don't let the minor version bump in the number put you off here. This was and is a very significant change that, arguably this should have been TLS version 2.0. So don't let that minor version number kind of, give the wrong idea of how significant this was. So with TLS 1.3 having been introduced now, again, we can see that just looking at the highest protocol version supported here again, people on 1.2 are very quickly jumping up to TLS 1.3. And as much as there are some phenomenal security advantages in TLS 1.3, I can't help but feel it's the same motivation that got people to use 1.2. It's the performance things that people are looking for, because nowadays performance is critical to everything online. So moving to TLS 1.3 lets you leverage those just like major performance advantages that are available. So taking a look at some broader data now in terms of how well are we encrypting everything online? And there are some really good data sets out there. Google have their transparency report that they publish frequently and update. So we can go all the way back to the beginning of 2014 with this. This is the more general graph that shows how much of Google's traffic is encrypted. So you can see here, and if we go back to just the start of 2014, we're around about the 50% mark. If we fast forward until the latest snapshot that I took here, we're basically coming up towards the back end of 2019, and we're pretty much kind of at the 90% of Google's traffic is encrypted. Now, the reason that I focus on this one in particular is that we have to remember we're talking about Google here, right? One of the largest technology companies in the world. And what we're not saying is everything is encrypted, right? Like, should this not be at 100%? And if you look at the increase in the line, actually, again, we've kind of seen this plateau trend where they've gone from 50% to 90% in a reasonably short period of time. But to me, if you look at the right side of that graph, it's pretty much flat now. So even for a company the size and the scale and with the budgets that Google must have, we're not saying everything is encrypted. That's not where we are, unfortunately. And it doesn't matter where you look. Now, if we take the breakdown of the Google data and look at, Gmail traffic, YouTube search, advertising, we can see that there is actually quite a large difference here. One of the biggest things that held websites back from using encryption is actually the advertising line here. So if you look at this blue line, this is basically what percentage of Google ads were served over HTTPS. Now, one of the things that could hold you back from switching your own website from HTTP to HTTPS are all of our dependencies available over HTTPS? Because if you want your page to be HTTPS, everything that loads on it also needs to be HTTPS. Now, if you were using Google Ads, especially quite a few years ago here, 2014, 2015 time, there was a really good chance that you weren't getting any HTTPS ads. So if you switch your website, there was a really good chance that you would lose ad revenue. And this was a particularly big blocker. And you can see this, like just 2014-15, this super sharp incline in the amount of ads that were served over HTTPS, because the requirement was there. People needed them to be served securely. If you're a media website, news organizations are particularly dependent on advertising revenue like this. They can't switch to HTTPS unless all of their dependencies are ready. So seeing particularly this very sharp incline in Google's advertising traffic that was served over HTTPS was really important to remove the barrier for websites that depended on that. Now, if we take a look again at different platforms, so rather than looking at different streams of traffic for Google, different platforms, there is quite a big variation there between, where are we? Linux kind of down around the 80, well, maybe even 70% mark. But if you're using Chrome OS, the chances of all your traffic being encrypted are considerably higher. I guess no matter which way we look at that, the trend is going in the right direction. But the other point that's really prevalent, again, is, kind of 2014 to 19, very nice incline. But to me, again, at the end of those graphs there, we are starting to see that plateau. We are, we have seen a very sharp rise, and now the lines are starting to kind of flatten off. And this is a very common trend in the data, even if we switch over to Firefox now. So this is data from Mozilla, from Firefox. And what we're looking at here is the percentage of page loads in Firefox browser that took place over HTTPS. Now, again, back around about 2014, when at the start of when we have reliable data here, we'll call that 25% of page loads were taking place on a secure connection. Just 25%. That's only, a little bit over 6 years ago from now. And that's a very low number. But between 2014 and, the back end of 2019, 2020, here we get right up to 80%. And that's a pretty fundamental transformation in just, close to 6 years. That is a really big change. And it's good that we have this change. But again, look at the right side of that graph line. To me, we have this very sharp incline, and then it is starting to plateau. And if we go and grab the last couple of months' data that are now available, you can really start to see that plateau has come in. So what interests me here is that these are completely independent vendors with their own completely independent data, yet we're seeing the same trend consistently. So it's not just an anomaly from one particular vendor or product. This does seem to be a constant trend. The one last thing I want to clarify on this one here, this is, as I said, this is Firefox data from Mozilla. This is the percentage of page loads that take place on HTTPS. And I commonly see this kind of misunderstood or misinterpreted as the percentage of websites on HTTPS. So I have, in the past seen articles or things that point to this and say, wow, look, yes, we have, 80% of websites on HTTPS. And that's not what the graph is actually showing. It's saying that 80% of the page loads in Firefox happen on HTTPS. Now, the reason I make that distinction is that depending on who you speak to, and the numbers do vary, like quite a good portion here, but if I average them out, it's around about 10% of websites are on HTTPS. That seems to be the kind of the sweet spot for the number of websites on HTTPS. The reason this graph line is so high and that we have 80% of page loads on HTTPS is because, if you think about it, we have websites like Google, Facebook, Twitter, and Wikipedia all serve HTTPS. Think about the portion of page loads that happen on those websites versus all of the others. So this is why the data in this regard is kind of so heavily skewed. We have a phenomenal percentage of page loads taking place on HTTPS because those huge amount of page loads take place on a very small number of websites that have HTTPS. So I just wanted to kind of put that little piece of data in there, that the percentage of websites that have it is actually very small. When you're looking at page load data, always remember, Google and Wikipedia probably account for a phenomenal chunk of these page loads here. It's still good. We're still heading in the right direction. I just feel like that's a point worth clarifying. So as we kind of come towards the last piece of data here now, the HTTP archive is another really big one that I look at. And the reason that I took their data and used this is that they're not looking at client-based data like Google and Firefox are with their browsers. The HTTP archive are looking at the website itself. So they're going to websites, they're going to the sites that are out there and connecting to them and looking at what percentage of them make make them use HTTPS. So this isn't from the client's perspective as such. This is from the application, the server's perspective. And again, we still see a very similar trend, which is it's nice to look at data from different perspectives and still see that we're aligned on our view and our understanding. It gives much more confidence that we are actually correct in our belief. So again, looking at the data that I can go back about start of 2016, we're seeing around about kind of 25%-ish of websites reverting over to HTTPS. And again, if we fast forward to the back end of 2019, we're well up over that 80% mark. So the good thing is that no matter which way we approach it, which way that we try and look at this, we are seeing a consistent view. We do find agreement. Now, this leaves like kind of one more interesting point to look at. And I wanted to just confirm with my own data that, you know, we all agree, and also just to check my own data. So I run this project called crawler.ninja. I have a small fleet of crawlers. They crawl the top 1 million most highly trafficked websites in the world every day. So I used to grab the Alexa ranking. Now I grab a ranking called the Tranco list. But it basically says these are the top 1 million visited websites today. And then my crawler fleet will crawl them and do various pieces of security analysis. But again, one of them was, is the site actively redirecting to HTTPS, and what kind of protocol versions and things do they support? Do they have a modern configuration or an old configuration? Now, if I just look at the percentage of sites that support HTTPS, we can see my data goes back to August 2015 when I started gathering this, and that is the line right down at the bottom. And then every 6 months when I produce these reports, so as I said, the crawler runs every day, but every 6 months I do an analysis and kind of look at what progress has been made. Every 6 months you can see that not only does this line jump up, but actually the jumps get bigger as well. And this is another kind of really consistent theme, is that not only did we, around about kind of 2014 time, start to see that nice incline in the use of encryption, we really stepped on the gas and had a strong drive towards encrypting the web. However, again, we now are starting to see this plateau. So this was really good that I could find and see the same trend in my own data, because it kind of confirmed to me that my data was finding the same trend, so everything looked good. But also it was good to have another source that backed up the same conclusion. So I took all of this data, and what I did was look at it and say, okay, I can kind of go back to around about 2013 with reliable sources of data from different locations. Now, if we think 1994, right over on the left side of this graph, that was when we first got encryption online. Between 1994 and 2013, it's incredibly difficult to find something reliable there to plot the line. So between 2013 and, you know, kind of 2020, where we are now, we have a lot of different sources of data. But what does the line look like between 94 and 2013? Now here it just drops to 0 because I have no data. I don't think that we did all of our effort in 2012 and went from 0 to, you know, kind of 25%. So maybe the line looks a bit more like this. But then the question is, well, how far back does the slope go? You know, where should we draw this kind of left 2/3 of the graph? Maybe it looks more like this. You know, maybe we had the introduction of SSL in 94 and we've just seen this progressive, steady incline for, you know, for those entire number of years. And I guess in many ways we'll never know because the data simply doesn't exist. And I guess also in many ways it doesn't matter because we know where we were in 2012, 2013. You know, we have reliable data to say where we were then. It was around about the 20-25% mark. And we also have reliable data to say where we are now, which is like way up in the 80-90% regions. So what we can say is that no matter what progress we made between 1994 and kind of 2012, we have more than tripled it since 2012. So I guess it really doesn't matter what progress we made back then. We can say that we've made all of the progress, pretty much all of the progress that we've made in the last few years alone. So the efforts that have gone in from the industry have worked. And, you know, we've had so much of a focus in the industry on encrypting the web recently, and it has paid off. No matter how we draw that left side of the graph, that line, we know that the vast majority happened over on the right side of this graph. Now, because we've had that very sharp change recently, we've had this huge drive to getting websites using encryption, there's always people ready when something changes to leverage that change for bad reasons, right? Something new has happened or something is different. There is maybe confusion or misunderstanding. And there's always someone waiting to jump in and take advantage of that for bad reasons. And the deployment of encryption on the web to give us better privacy and security was no difference, because the criminals or the phishers, whoever you want to refer to them as, were out there and they were ready to jump on this. So Netcraft has some really good data going back on this. And this data here is looking at how many phishing websites were using encryption. Now, this is kind of an interesting angle, because we're trying to encourage, banks and social media websites and all of the different websites that we use to use encryption to give us protection. And now it's like, okay, but all of the phishing websites also seem to be starting to use encryption. And I'm like, oh, wow, how nice. The criminals, when they're trying to steal my credit card, want to protect my credit card so that it can't get stolen. They want to encrypt it. And I'm like, hang on, but they're stealing it. Like, what? Why are they using encryption? And in some cases, more frequently than most of the other websites that I use as well. And it turned out that, if we look at the data, there was a really big trend. Komodo and Let's Encrypt, both particularly large on this graph, because they had free certificate offerings. They had the ability to go and get a certificate for free. So phishers, criminals could go to these websites and effectively purchase a certificate, but without the need to give credit card or financial details, which would create a paper trail. So Komodo and Let's Encrypt both featured quite high in these rankings and these numbers, largely just because they gave away certificates for free. But it did show that there was a very big focus for phishing websites to go and get certificates because they wanted encryption. And I always wondered, kind of why this was. And it's very easy to demonstrate why. And I'm going to demonstrate why with this advert. So hopefully the video and the sound will come through good on the webinar. We tested this earlier and it worked, but that doesn't mean it's going to work now. But this was an advert shown in the UK, and it was right before Christmas. So this is on the run up to, that time of the year when everybody may be going online to do online shopping. We're going to be typing in our credit cards. We're going to be buying stuff. And this advert was shown on primetime UK television. So just take a look at this and think, what is it that I might pick up on in this advert?
Supercar! Defender of the galaxy, complete with powerful disc cannon and realistic sounding jetpack!
Defender of the... Oh, you know what? I can't do this. It's all rubbish. It's a scam. If you order me, you'll get nothing. Look, in there, you need a padlock when you pay for stuff. If there isn't one, the website could be fake. Oh, look at that.
Defeat online fraudsters this Christmas!
So we could look at that, and I mean, it's pretty clear. The advert takes a very sharp twist right in the middle when the little robot pulls down the web address bar at the top there. And the particular thing that I take incident within that is he says, when you're paying for stuff online, you need to look for a padlock up there in the address bar. If there isn't one, the website could be a fake. Now, this is a very dangerous precedent that was set. And this was only recently. This was in the last couple of years. That this precedent has been set for a very long time. But it just kind of struck me that this is one of our largest high street banks in the UK, super recognizable brand, with an advert on television in the prime time in the evening when people are going to be watching it, talking about giving, cybersecurity advice to people. And they're saying that check for a padlock in the address bar, because if there's no padlock, the website could be a fake, which is implying that if there is a padlock, then the website is not a fake. Now, the padlock just means that the page is encrypted. That's all that a padlock in the address bar means. The page, or your connection, is encrypted. Encryption does not mean that you are on a safe website. You could have an encrypted connection to the devil's website, right? And, it's not going to make the devil a better person just because you have an encrypted connection. The person at the other side can be good or bad. How you communicate with them, whether it is encrypted or not, has no bearing and no impact on that. But this is a super common thing that we see. And this was very, very misleading. And this was actually reported to the ASA, which is the Advertising Standards Agency here in the UK. So they govern the things that you're allowed to say in adverts. Did you mislead or misinform in some way? And if you do, then you get in trouble with the ASA. Now, this was reported to the ASA. 15 people got in touch and said, look, this is just wrong. Like, this is inaccurate. The ad misleadingly implied that website URLs with green padlocks were guaranteed to be safe. And I think, I think it is reasonable to say that the advert implied that. That's certainly the impression that I got when I watched it. So this was the complaint made to the ASA, and they're saying that the padlock does not mean safety. The padlock basically just means encryption. And the ASA investigated this and actually said, we agree. We agree that this advert is misleading. They said that consumers were generally unlikely to have a detailed understanding of the website padlock symbol. And what they mean here is that the consumer is unlikely to understand, in essence, the simplicity of what the padlock means. The padlock just means it's encrypted. That's it. It doesn't mean that it's safe or trustworthy or good or any other word that you might use. And, just to clarify, when I say that, I'm not criticizing the consumer for not having that understanding. I don't think that consumers should have to have that understanding. I don't think that we should place that burden on them. I think that the ASA was correct. This was misleading, and that we shouldn't expect people to have to be, technical experts and understand what the padlock means and what encryption means. So they were told to change the advert. They had to take the advert away, and they were not allowed to use that in its current form. It had to be adapted. So the other thing that they said in their ruling, which I thought was really important, was the ASA said, we told Barclays Bank to ensure that they made clear that the website padlock security measure did not guarantee safety. And this was a really important and very clear point. The padlock does not mean that the website is safe. But the fact that the ASA had to say this shows that there is the misunderstanding that people do think the padlock means safety. If you see, this was a bank, and they managed to put this in an advert that they probably spent an awful lot of money on. This understanding was so common and so prevalent that, people do believe that the padlock means safe, and it doesn't. And this is ultimately, of course, why these phishing websites are using it. But it wasn't just Barclays. We have loads of examples of organizations, and this is just here in the UK. I'm sure we could do the same for Norway, perhaps, and other countries as well. I'm sure that there is this very common trend of this misunderstanding that the little padlock up in the address bar there means this website is safe, and it doesn't mean anything more than your encryption is in place. So this is a very common thing, and it's something that a lot of effort has gone into changing in the last few years, because this misunderstanding was so common and so prevalent, it kind of had to be changed. And I like the way that the browsers are now changing this. They're basically changing their UI to solve this problem, and they're changing their UI to be more similar to how this indicator works. Now, I'm sure many people here know what this indicator means. If you are not a car person and you see this indicator turn on in your car, it means that you need to get your wallet out, because it's about to cost you some money. This is what we call an EML, which is an engine management light. If this comes on in your car, it means that your car's computer has detected a problem that needs your pretty immediate attention. Your car may even not work at this point if it's serious. But the point is, this only comes on when there is something wrong, when there is a problem, when there is something that needs your attention for a bad reason. You don't have a green check mark on the dashboard of your car that says, hey, you got in the car and started it and everything is okay. It's like, well, if I get in my car and start it, I expect everything to be okay. That's the normal situation. I only need you to blink at me and show me stuff when there's a problem that needs my attention. And this is the kind of transition that browsers are currently going through. They're switching from having the model of, this green padlock, this green secure text, this green thing, which is basically they're saying, hey, like, this good stuff is happening. And it's like, okay, I don't need to know the good stuff is happening. I expect the good stuff to be happening. How about you just let me know when there's something bad happening that needs my attention? Now, this change started happening quite a few years ago. And we landed like the first proper change in this regard in July 2018 in Chrome version 68. Now, up until this point, a HTTP website never had any negative markers. If you went to one website on HTTP, that it was just what we would call the normal UI. There was no difference. If you went to a website on HTTPS, you would get these like green positive markers, the padlock, the word secure, something to be like, yeah, this looks good, this is great. And these were the things that were being misinterpreted. So we needed to take all of these positive green things and kind of start to peel them back and start to introduce warnings instead when things were bad, when things were not good. And this was the first change that really kind of kicked off this trend. And it's not just Chrome. I'm just using the example of their timeline here. But they said, look, we're going to start to add the warnings to HTTP and take away the positives and the greens and the everything's else for HTTPS. Now, we're actually, I guess the cool thing about doing this on a webinar is that I can just show you. Let me just drag a browser window over here. And if I just go to kind of my personal website here now, you can see that, you know, for those of you that may remember this a few years back, this padlock used to be green, and it used to have the green secure text. So it would be like padlock secure and then the website URL. So we had this very positive experience. Now the word secure is gone. Now the green is gone. It's just gone to a very simple grey padlock. And very soon we may indeed lose either the padlock or the HTTPS text as well. And likewise, now the warnings on HTTP websites have become much more strict. So you can see previously on a HTTP website, there was no warning. In the example here on the slide, you can see that there is just the grey not secure text. But another change that's happened since then now, if you look at that little information icon, it's become a warning triangle. So it's got slightly more kind of severe, if you will. It's like, oh, this is definitely not getting any better. So this is a progressive change. The green and the positive things are slowly being walked backwards, and the warnings and the not secures. And eventually, very soon, this not secure text will actually turn red. So this will become a much more prominent warning. So we can see something much more prominent in Firefox and their implementation. Again, you know, this is kind of a very clear indicators. It says not secure. They've got the red strike through the padlock. They've got the information icon there as well, you know. And again, if we look at the later versions of these browsers, they have taken a couple more steps recently. And this is the correct direction. Tell people when there is a problem, when everything is okay, just let them get on. We don't need any visual feedback. So just before I wrap up at the end, I just want to kind of show a quick couple of things in the direction that I would like this to go. So again, another video, hopefully the sound will come through, and hopefully people here can recognize what this was. This was a little while back now when SpaceX launched 2 of their Falcon 9 boosters up into space, brought them back down and landed them side by side on the landing pad. And remember, bear in mind, these rockets here, they're like a 30-story building tall or something. These things are ginormous. And they brought these 2 things back down and landed them side by side like this. So I watched this live when it happened, and I still remember this. I did the Space Geek, and this was just such a phenomenal technological feat. The ability to do this is just incredible. And I remember I was either listening or reading an interview with Elon Musk shortly after this, and he was saying that he wants this to become boring. And I was like, how could this ever be boring? This is the coolest thing ever to watch. How would this be boring? And he was saying, I want to do this so frequently and so regularly, and with obviously nothing's exploding or crashing and things like that. You know, this will become just so mundane that it will be boring, because this super awesome, cool thing that we have a huge focus on now will just become the norm. And this is really what I want encryption to be like. We've had so much focus recently on talking about encryption and how we need encryption and we want encryption to be everywhere. I'm sure there's many people here who have seen friends or family or colleagues or something like that talking about VPNs and encryption. Like, oh, I'm going on a trip and I'm going to an airport when we used to be able to go to airports, and I'm going to turn on my VPN to give me the extra encryption and the protection. And I think I want encryption to become so commonplace, so just the norm, that we don't even need to talk about it anymore. I think it should be the default position that should not have to be talked about. But inevitably, when I talk about encryption this much and I become so passionate about it, this question always comes up. And someone says to me, wow, you must be doing some really bad shit on the internet if you need all this encryption, Scott. Like, what is it that you are trying to hide from, from the government or from law enforcement or from everybody else? Like, why do you need to protect your stuff so much? And I think this is such a bad argument. I probably have nothing of interest to hide to anyone, but that's not the point. The point is that encryption gives us privacy, and privacy is actually a fundamental human right. Aside from everything else, you don't have to have something to hide to need or want encryption. So don't be lulled into that kind of argument that only bad people use encryption, and encryption means that you have something to hide. Many people do appreciate their privacy, but they just don't see it in the same way. And in a very similar conversation with a very a person with a very similar opinion, we got talking about the fact that I have an Echo. I actually have an Amazon Echo right here. And I can't say her name because she'll wake up and start listening to me. But this person was like, no way, I'm not having one of those things in my house because they can listen to everything that I say. And I was like, oh, well, this is very interesting. Like, me wanting encryption means I have something to hide. I was like, what do you have to hide? You don't want one of these devices in your home because they listen all the time. But I thought you only had something to hide if you wanted privacy. So I think people do understand it. I just think that they sometimes have it slightly the wrong way round. Just because you want privacy does not mean that you have something to hide. And one of the first times I gave this talk, actually, it was only this year. It's a brand new talk. I think this is the third time I've done it. But the very first time I did it, somebody, a good friend of mine called Carol on the Smashing Security podcast, came up to me after the talk and she was like, wow, I was listening to it and it really made me think of this particular quote from this person. And it was such a good point to raise that I actually put it in as the next slide. And it was this: if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. Now, this was from a guy called Joseph, I think it's Goebbels. My German pronunciation is probably really bad. And they were the Nazi Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. And the general gist, and I did some more reading on this, the general gist of this was, the Nazi state should be able to know everything about you and everything you think and say and do, because there should be nothing bad in there. And if there is something bad in there, then we need to know about it so we can come and fix the bad stuff. It's just like, wow, okay, yeah, this is a pretty extreme example of the problem here, but hopefully that kind of puts into some perspective how bad it can go the other way if we're not careful. So to wrap up on another kind of penultimate quote here now, this one from Edward Snowden, probably a significant portion of the driver towards encryption on the web in the last few years, certainly the Snowden revelations. He said, arguing that you don't care about the right to privacy because you have nothing to hide is no different than saying you don't care about free speech because you have nothing to say. And I think this is another really important quote, to think that just because you don't feel like you have something to hide now, if we let our privacy go and we let it be eroded or slip away, it's never coming back, and you might care about it in the future. So I feel like this is a slippery slope, and once we slip one bit down that slope, we're not coming back. So we have to be careful now. Even though you don't feel that you have something particular to hide, remember, it's not about that. It's about retaining it, because I think once it's gone, it's not coming back. So for me, and to wrap up on my kind of closing quote here, I think if we were to build the web with the knowledge that we have today, I don't even think encryption would be a question. I think it would just be default, and it would be top to bottom, like ground up, everything would be secure. So for me, it's not a case of adding a new feature. It's about fixing kind of an oversight in the original design, something that we just didn't know about, things that we could not foresee. So for me, the lack of encryption on the web is a bug, and I do believe that we should fix that. So that's everything from me. Thank you all very much for joining in. I'm just going to switch back over to the Slack channel over here. And I've also got the, let me fire up the webinar chat panel here. If there are any questions, I think, do I have a couple of minutes? I like to leave at least a few minutes to answer a couple of questions. Maybe Jacob's just going to come and turn me off. But I think we do look good there. There are some comments, but none of them look like questions as such. So let's have a look. I'll wrap it up there. I'll hand back over to the NDC control room. I think there's someone here to take over the stream from me. And thank you very much for coming.